I recently made a video discussing the question of whether the little branch line between Greenford and West Ealing should become part of the London Overground. There were some very interesting comments on that video, some of them regarding points I'd missed about the Greenford branch, which I'll talk about at the end. But some of you wondered if the Northern City line should become an overground line. It is something I've heard suggested many times. So here we go, let's talk about it. The Northern City line has had a bit of a strange history, which I'll try to sum up as briefly as I can. It has, or had, the nickname of the Big Tube. It was originally designed for a very specific purpose. At the end of the 19th century, the main line into King's Cross was very congested, so the Great Northern and City Railway Company was formed to build a new underground line from Finsbury Park to Moorgate. They approached the Great Northern Railway, who ran the main line into King's Cross, about collaborating. The idea was that the Great Northern Railway would bring some of their trains into Finsbury Park. The locomotive would be swapped for an electric one, which would haul the train into Moorgate, which was in the city proper, and therefore, in theory, an attractive destination for the Great Northern. Unfortunately, the Great Northern Railway changed their mind, too late for the Great Northern and City, who had already begun construction. So instead, the line was built as a short tube line, large enough to take mainline trains, but of fairly limited use in itself due to its isolation. It opened in 1904. It was not very successful, and in 1913 it was bought by the Metropolitan Railway, who planned to connect it to what we now call the Circle Line. But that never went ahead. The scheme also riled the Great Northern Railway up, because they worried that the Metropolitan would use it to get onto their turf in North London. In 1933, all the underground lines of London, apart from the Waterloo and City, were taken over by London Transport. In 1935, the New Works programme was announced. One of the plans put forward in this was to take over some of the former Great Northern Railway branch lines out in the suburbs and connect them to what we now know as the Northern Line. The Northern City line would have been part of this, providing an alternative route into the city. This scheme was only partly completed due to the Second World War and subsequent financial shortages. However, the Northern City line did officially become part of the Northern Line. The trouble was, it didn't make much sense as a branch of the Northern Line unless it was connected to the rest, which it never was. It was, to all intents and purposes, a completely separate line, as it always had been. By the 70s, London Transport had come to accept that their grand plans for the Northern Line would never fully come to pass, so they decided to hand over to British Rail in 1975. Before they could, February 1975 saw the Moorgate crash, the worst peacetime disaster in the history of the Underground. Nevertheless, the handover went ahead. The line is now basically fulfilling the function it was planned for. Commuter trains from north of London now dive underground at Finsbury Park and make their way to Moorgate, taking some of the pressure off King's Cross. It's an odd little line, and perhaps it's no surprise that someone or other is always suggesting that something should be done with it. Back in the 80s, for instance, there was a proposal to incorporate it into a third Crossrail line, because I guess people were just more optimistic back then. More recently, the Green Party proposed connecting it to the Waterloo and City line, which is the other line where someone always thinks it should be extended even though there's no real reason to do so. A lot of these schemes tend to be dismissed as playing with crayons, rail schemes for the sake of it. I hate to admit it, but that was my initial reaction when I heard people calling for the Northern City line to become an overground line. Because, as it is, it serves a useful purpose. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. As opposed to much of the Northern City line's history when it very much was broke. I guess there was also a part of me thinking, how many changes of ownership does this thing need? But in fact, it turns out this was something seriously discussed. Correspondence has been made public from 2020 between Chris Heaton-Harris, then Minister of State for Transport, and Heidi Alexander, Deputy Mayor of London. This would have seen the suburban services operated by Great Northern, no relation to the Victorian company I mentioned earlier, being handed over to TfL, or, in the language of politicians, devolved. It would result in the TfL map gaining some stations that definitely push the definition of for London, although that's hardly without precedent. The services to be handed over would have been those from Moorgate to Stevenage and Welwyn Garden City, including the Hertford Loop. Actually, this had previously caused the plan to be rejected by former Transport Secretary Chris Grayling. TfL is answerable to the Mayor of London, but a significant number of stations would be well outside of London, so it hardly seems fair that London's authorities should decide what happens to them. Any plans would require consultation with the outlying towns to be served were the plan to be revived. In some ways, the plan was relatively simple, no major rejigging of services, just handing some routes over to TfL more or less as they were, minus perhaps some services into King's Cross. There is a caveat about finding depot space and the difficulty of fitting TfL trains around other trains using those tracks, but on the whole it all looks quite optimistic. So much so that it looked like the process might be complete as early as 2022. Well, of course it wasn't, because you know what else happened in 2020. The pandemic knocked everything back. At present, there do not appear to be any plans to add these lines to TfL. There has been a massive programme of investment to upgrade the signalling to the European Train Control System. Basically, this does away with line-side signals in favour of digital in-cab signalling. So it might be argued that the lines already had plenty of investment, so what benefits would adding it to TfL bring, especially with the railways being nationalised anyway? So, could the Northern City Line become part of the Overground? Yes. Should it? I'm not fully convinced. Well, that's that fence-sitting non-conclusion out of the way. Now, back to Greenford. A point several viewers made that was worthy of note was that, while the Greenford line sees fairly limited passenger numbers, it nevertheless sees quite a lot of freight. And this is a very important point. I will hold my hands up and say it's something I should have brought up. Freight has been the saving of many lines in London, many of which are in fact now part of the Overground. While British Rail was running passenger services down in the 60s and 70s, freight was using these routes to get around London without having to clog up the busy railways in central London. So there was never the economic justification to close them down fully. So what this means basically is that my suggestion of converting the Greenford branch to a tram is actually kind of a non-starter unless you can find an alternative route for the goods trains. I understand it's also used for empty stock movements, so, ditto. I guess this means we're back to the Overground as the front-runner if you wanted to upgrade the branch. But given that the branch sees so few users since the service to Paddington was discontinued, I guess it might be hard to justify. I'll leave that one up to the politicians. I also had some people tell me that there's an early morning service along the branch from Ealing Broadway, which I have a feeling I have heard about in the past. Possibly in one of Jeff Marshall's videos? Maybe I should have a go on that. Well, anyway, plenty to think about. Well, I do hope you enjoyed today's video. If so, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more. I would like, as always, to thank my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon, and here on YouTube for your generous support. You are the freight train to my underused London branch. And I will see you all, yes, very soon. Cheerio.